There's so many moving parts to climate change, it's hard to know where to start to fix things. One way could be encouraging people to change their behavior so they use fewer resources. Another way could be finding money to help communities be more resilient. Want to hear some hopeful ideas for how to do both? Keep listening. I'm Amanda Thomas, and you're listening to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. This is a special episode that's a little different than our usual format. I had the opportunity to talk with Robert H. Frank about his new book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work, which comes out on January 28, 2020. I spoke to him in mid-January from my home here in Portland, Oregon, while he was at his home in New York. In the book, he describes some ways that people can change their behavior to help improve the environment, as well as some ways to pay for fixing it. Spoiler alert, it involves taxing rich people and companies who are contributing the most to climate change, but in a way that doesn't require painful sacrifices from anyone. Robert has a PhD in economics and is the Henrietta Johnson Lewis Professor of Management and Professor of Economics at Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management. He's a prolific author. He's written 13 books that have been translated into 23 languages. His column Economic View appeared monthly in the New York Times for 10 years, and his CV has more than 15 pages of selected articles from publications such as The Atlantic Magazine and the Journal of Economic Perspectives. I'll put links to the bio and this book in the episode notes. This is the first time we've done a remote interview recording like this, and the recording got compressed a bit, so please ignore any audio weirdness. We'll get it better next time. With that, here's my conversation with Robert Frank. So, welcome. Glad that you can be here today.
Thanks for having me on your show, Amanda.
Appreciate you being here. So most of your other books are on economic theory and things about how personal responsibility and success and luck and how people personal lives relate to economics. But this book is a little bit different in that you talk about climate change. Why?
I wasn't really setting out to write a book focused on climate change. This book does have in common with most of my other books that it really focuses on the social dimensions of behavior. Many economic models think about people as isolated islands. They behave as if they were living all by themselves on an island. We don't take into account their concerns about how they relate to other people and how things relate to other things. All that's more or less absent from the traditional narrative. And this book, like my earlier ones, does focus on that. But it became clear to me in the process of writing this book that the reason we've done the things that have produced the climate crisis, I mean, the economists and the climatologists say we emit carbon because it's expensive to filter it out and they don't punish us for doing it. But that's true. But the real reason we have been building bigger houses and driving heavier cars and staging destination weddings and using all sorts of energy intensive activities is not so much that the activities are priced incorrectly. It's much more that we do those things because other people like us are also doing them. If other people weren't doing them, even if they were cheap, we wouldn't do them either. And so I see in that basic tendency to be shaped by what others do, the seeds of the climate crisis, but also the seeds of a solution to it.
Yeah, in your book, you talk a lot about the phrase, the behavioral contagion, and use smoking as an analogy throughout the book, and you explain why at the beginning. And can you talk a little bit about behavioral contagion and what you mean by that?
Sure. The smoking example is, I think, the one that's easiest to grasp. You don't need any special tools to think about it. And if you can really get that example firmly rooted in your mind, then I think it becomes pretty quickly clear that all the other examples are structurally identical to it. Suppose you're a parent. You've got a teenage daughter. You're worried that she's going to smoke. I've never met a parent who said, I hope my kid grows up to be a smoker. I'm guessing you've never met a parent who said that either.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
It would be very strange, knowing what we know now, that a parent would think that. Well, virtually every parent hopes his kids will grow up not to be smokers. So if you're worried about that, what are the things that would tell you where she's headed? Well, it doesn't help at all to know that she's a science fiction buff. That doesn't predict anything about whether she'll be a smoker. If she likes English or math better, that doesn't matter either. What really is going to predict how likely she is to smoke is one simple number. It's the proportion of her friends who smoke. If that number goes up by 50%, according to one careful study, she's about 25% more likely to become or to remain a smoker. And so if you had a choice as a parent, you would much rather your child grow up in an environment where not very many of her friends smoked. That's not something you can control very easily, but if you had a choice in the matter, you would want that. What we know more generally is that the social environment is probably the most important determinant, the most important explanation of why we do what we do. So the psychologists have a nice saying. They say, it's the situation, not the person. And what they mean by that is that when people see somebody do something and they're trying to explain why it happened, the tendency is to fixate on traits of character or personality. Oh, she did that because she's this kind of person, or some such explanation as that, when the psychologist insists that much more often the compelling reason for why she did what she did was the particulars of the social circumstances that she found herself in when she made the decision to act. So that's the smoking example. Writ large, it applies virtually to everything. What you eat is influenced by that, how polite you are, whether you save a lot, whether you exercise regularly, whether you're a bully, whether you engage in sexual predation in the workplace. All of those things are very, very strongly predicted by what others like you who surround you are doing. So that's old news. There's nobody who would argue with any of that for a moment. What's true too, and what has attracted less notice, is that the social environment, this thing that shapes us for good and ill in different circumstances, this social environment, where does that come from? It's a consequence itself of the very choices that we make as individuals. We don't think about that because the effect of our own individual choices on the social environment is so small. So somebody thinking about whether to smoke would not normally ask herself, oh, maybe I shouldn't smoke. If I do, I'll make others more likely to smoke. That's true, she will, but the effect of her own individual decision would be small, and most people wouldn't give that much thought. It would be better, though, if people did give it some thought, if they did choose and behave in ways as if they cared about their effects on the social environment. We want good social environments for ourselves and our kids. We're more likely to do the things we feel we should do in good social environments. We're less likely to do the things we feel we shouldn't. So we want good social environments, and yet policymakers have given virtually no serious attention to the question of how we might encourage people to behave as if they cared about how their actions affect the social environment. That's such a strange thing to me. And it turns out that, as in the smoking example, there are really simple steps we could take that would make people act as if they cared about the social environment. So in the case of smoking, what we did, starting in the 1950s and accelerating in the 1980s and 90s, we started putting heavier and heavier taxes on cigarettes. We started banning smoking in buildings, restaurants, bars, and in some jurisdictions, even in public spaces, we've banned it. And now the smoking rate, which was 3 times what it was when I was a teenager, and that's the principal reason why none of my adult sons ever became a smoker. I started smoking at age 14 because most of my friends had already been smoking for a year or two by then. My parents were smokers. It was just the thing to do back then. There are still some circles where most people smoke, but for the most part, kids growing up today have friends who don't smoke. And that's a great thing. And we got there not because people responded exclusively to the higher prices that we imposed on cigarettes through taxation, but that had some effect that got the ball rolling. Mainly, it was a matter of some people responding to that incentive, others having fewer smokers amongst their peers as a result of that, and in turn, them becoming much less likely to smoke. And when they smoked at a lower rate, others smoked at a lower rate too, and it radiated on outward. That's the real reason that the smoking rate dropped so heavily in the decades since I was a teenager. It's just behavioral contagion. And it's very hard to see why any aspect of that process could draw a cogent objection. Why wouldn't we want that to have happened? I mean, nobody likes taxes, of course, but every dollar we raise in taxes is a dollar we could reduce some other tax by. So currently we tax payrolls. That's a tax on workers that are hired by firms. That discourages workers from being hired by firms. Why would we want to discourage something like that? Taxing a harmful activity, an activity that has a harmful effect on the social environment, lets us reduce taxes on beneficial activities.
Yeah, you mentioned something about specifically in the smoking analogy, but in also other contexts as well, about restricting individual freedom is often the only way to prevent undue harm to innocent bystanders. And that idea of encouraging people to not do the bad thing so that they encourage other people to not do the bad thing as well seems like it that's not a very eloquent way of putting the thesis of your book, but that seems to be kind of a common theme of.
Yeah, that's the nut graph right there. And when I first did a piece about this in the smoking example, the pushback I got was, well, it's not really the government's responsibility to decide for people which behaviors they ought to imitate amongst their peers and which ones they ought to try to avoid. That's your responsibility as a person to make that decision. I think that's rhetorically a forceful observation. I have sympathy with the sentiment that motivates that thought. But what about the parents who want their kids to grow up to be non-smokers? They have no recourse. They can do their best to try to persuade their kids not to smoke, as my parents indeed did unsuccessfully. There's only so much you can do. If you work too hard to persuade your kid not to smoke, your kid becomes more likely to smoke. Unless we want to say that it's an illegitimate goal for parents to try to raise their kids to be non-smokers, we have to say that when someone becomes a smoker, we don't know who's going to be led to smoke by that, but statistically, it's an absolute certainty that more parents will fail to achieve the perfectly legitimate goal of raising their kids to be healthy non-smokers when more people are out there smoking. So the reasons we've offered what we did in this case are essentially spurious. What we did was we said we need to regulate smoking because we need to protect hapless bystanders from the harm caused by secondhand smoke. There is harm caused by that. But the harm is minuscule compared to the actual harm from being a smoker. And the real harm you cause if you become a smoker is not to injure others by secondhand smoke. That's a trivial harm. The real harm is you make others more likely to smoke. And that's harm on a grand scale, we have to say. And if you accept John Stuart Mill's basic harm principle, he was the great champion of liberty. He said the only legitimate reason for the government to tell you you can't do what you want to do is to prevent you from causing harm to others. He must have meant undue harm to others because you can't do anything without causing at least some harm to somebody. So aren't you causing undue harm to others when you smoke? The answer is clearly yes. And taxing it is a little gentler by means of a response than saying, no, you can't do it. So some people may feel like they can't live without smoking. Okay, smoke, but you're causing harm. And in return for that, it's only fair that you pay a price to help compensate for the harm you've caused.
Walk me through how that relates to bigger houses and SUVs.
Okay, so what we saw in, let's take the vehicles case, people used to drive vehicles that were much, much smaller than the ones we see today. The SUVs were really a category that existed only for contractors and other tradespeople who needed the towing capacity and the space to haul materials. Then suddenly they became fashionable. People started buying them in greater numbers. Others noticed that now they were at greater risk of injury and death because their cars were lower down and lighter than the other cars on the road. They bought bigger too in self-defense, then some bought even bigger. And so the second group group bought bigger still, and we had a mine is bigger escalation of that process. And now we've got very, very big vehicles. The SUVs are by far the largest selling category of any vehicle in the country and have been. And what's the net result? The risk of injury and death in an accident is now higher than it used to be rather than lower. It's true. If you're in a big vehicle and somebody else is in a small one, your risk is lower. But when everybody drives big, everybody's risk goes up, not down. You're causing harm to others when you buy a heavier vehicle than you need. What if we taxed vehicles by weight? People would still be able to buy heavy vehicles if they needed them. If you go to the mountains every weekend and need to tow your boat up there and a light vehicle isn't up to the task, then buy a heavy one, but pay a tax indicating compensation for the harm that you've caused in the process of doing that. If we did that, some people would begin to buy smaller vehicles than they're buying now. Others would see that their risk had gone down. They would buy smaller vehicles too. And the whole cycle would be set to run in reverse. We'd have a race to the small end of the scale rather than a race to the big end. You asked also about houses. In the case of houses, there I think the main driver has been the change we've seen in the distribution of income. In the decades after World War II, incomes grew at about the same rate for people up and down the income ladder, about 3% a year, a little less than that. Since the early 1970s, at least, maybe even earlier than that, we've seen a reversal of that trend. The people at the bottom actually have lost some ground since then. The people in the middle have gained, but not very much, very, very small gains. The only significant gains have come in the top of the income distribution. So people in the top fifth have had significant gains. But if we look at people within the top fifth, it's the same pattern. The people at the bottom of that group haven't gained much. The real gains are in the top 5%, and then look inside that group, it repeats over and over again. The top 100th of 1%, those are the people who've seen absolutely astronomical gains. So that's the basic change in income growth patterns. What rich people have done, people at the high end of the scale, is they've done what people at every point along the scale do when they get more income. They buy bigger, so they've been building bigger houses. The people in the middle don't seem to object to the fact that the people at the top are building bigger houses and mansions. It's an object of interest to them. They want to see footage of it. Pictures and magazines are attractive to them. They think, I'll be rich someday. Let's see what it'll be like. Most of them are wrong. They won't be rich someday, but that's the view. So there's no harm there from what people see in any direct way. What's true, though, is that there are people just below the top group, the bottom half of the top 1%. They go to the same social functions as the people at the top. Maybe it's now the custom in that circle to host your daughter's wedding reception at home rather than at the country club. You've got a ballroom. You can do everything on premises. And so now people in that second group, well, we need a ballroom now. They build bigger. And then there's a group just below them. They socialize with the second group. Now it's maybe the custom to have dinner parties for 18, not 12. They build bigger. And we've seen a cascade all the way down the income ladder. The median new house, which was about 1,500 square feet in 1973, is now almost 2,400 square feet. And its price has gone up by way bigger proportion than its size has gone up. And you just can't explain why people in the middle are spending so much more on their houses, except that there's been this kind of expenditure cascade, this behavioral contagion that's filtered on down the income ladder. There's just no other cogent explanation for that pattern. And the people in the middle are hurting because of that. It not only wastes energy, the budget is under enormous stress for families in that situation. And yet, if they think about trying to cut back, maybe we should buy a house that we can more comfortably afford, they might say. But then if you think about that option, what's true about it is that in every jurisdiction, other countries I visited, it's the same everywhere. The good schools are located in the more expensive neighborhoods. And so what's immediately apparent is that if you want to send your kid to a school of just average quality. You're the median earner. That's your ambition. I want to send my kid to a school of average quality. If you were any less ambitious than that, we would think ill of you as a parent. What must you do? You must buy the median priced house for your area. And that's vastly more money now than it was relative to your income in 1973. And so we're burning up a whole lot of energy heating these houses, building these houses, maintaining these houses. And we're also forcing people to live farther from the center where they work because land's cheaper, the budgets are under stress, so they have to move further away. The commutes have gotten longer. We're burning more fuels on that account. It's just a whole cavalcade of effects, all tracing from this simple matter that what I spend depends on what others around me spend.
So in the book, you specifically say that you don't like the phrase keeping up with the Joneses, that that's not an accurate representation of this phenomenon you're describing. And can you explain why?
Yeah, that's the most common locution you hear for the influence of peer effects on spending and other things. And I've learned over the years that way of formulating the problem causes people to dismiss it. Do you think you try to keep up with the Joneses? I don't think I do. Most people don't think they care about keeping up with the Joneses. That whole notion conjures up the image of somebody who's trying to show off, trying to appear to be more wealthy than in fact he is, a phony, somebody who's putting on airs. Nobody wants to go there. And so I think people think this phenomenon is not very widespread, number one, and is not very important. But in fact, the contagion process really doesn't have anything much to do with trying to show off or one-upmanship. There are people like that, but they're rare. What it's really about is the world's a complicated place. We don't know what to do much of the time. And any individual besides us probably doesn't know what to do either. But collectively, all the people around us together know much more about what to do than any one of us does. And so when we see others doing something, that's a reasonable presumption that it might be worth our while to do that thing too. And so we have a very strong predisposition to do as others do. If you could wave a magic wand and have your kids be completely unaffected by that impulse, it's not clear that you would want to do that. It's not clear that that would help them make their way in the world. Yes, you have to make judgments about which behaviors to model after and which ones to avoid. That's your responsibility, yes. But to aspire to be completely independent of what others do, that's an unrealistic goal, but also probably an undesirable one.
In the book, you talk about these negative influences of buying bigger cars and bigger houses that are more wasteful and more costly and all of that. But you also talk about how this behavioral contagion can go towards the good. And, there's a quote in there: within 2 years, almost all public figures will find it prohibitively costly to challenge the validity of climate science in public. It's clearly not the case right now, but hopefully in 2 years, that will change. Can you talk a little bit about how we can use this behavioral contagion to the benefit of the earth?
Yes. Contagion is always and everywhere a two-way street. If you think about a movement toward buying heavier things, and that becomes contagious among people, and so we get a race to an equilibrium where everybody's buying as heavy as they can manage, it's by the exact same logic possible to imagine a cascade running in the opposite direction. So if we want to say, for example, that what you eat depends on what others around you eat, that cuts both ways depending on what they do. So there's a very interesting study where military families were stationed to a new location where the obesity rate was 1% higher than where they had been. When that happens during their time in the new location, they become 5% more likely to become obese. If the obesity rate in the new place is 1% higher than in the old place, in time, they become 5% more likely to become obese. If they would move to a place where the obesity rate was lower, they would become less likely to become obese. It's exactly a symmetric process. If you hang out with people who smoke less, you'll have a tendency to smoke less. If you hang out with people who smoke more, you will inexorably have a greater tendency to smoke more. With energy use, we know that there are some really vivid examples of positive contagion. So the example of solar panel adoption is a vivid one. There's a Project Sunroof that Google runs. What they'll do is you give them your address and they'll give you an aerial photo on the website of your neighborhood. Shot from the satellite, it will show the rooftops in your neighborhood with red dots on them if the house has a solar panel, and without red dots if it doesn't. And what you notice in those photos, you can scan many, many neighborhoods and you'll see the same pattern throughout, is that the houses that have red dots on them are almost always next to a house that also has a red dot. The houses without red dots are in clusters. They're next to houses that don't have them. So what we know is that if somebody installs a solar panel, the very first thing that happens is that people all along that block begin to consider whether they ought to also, and many of them start to do it, and it radiates outward from there.
Related to that and encouraging people to do things that are actually beneficial rather than harmful, you describe the concept of the mother of all cognitive illusions. And can you talk about that and what that means and how that affects us?
Okay, so it's been a theme in my work going back a long time that we don't spend our money very efficiently. There's a very large literature on the determinants of human well-being, happiness, if you want to have the shorthand term for it. It's more than happiness. It's a contentious literature. People argue about almost every conclusion, but one of the most robust findings in it, one of the least contentious claims from that literature, is that beyond a certain point, building bigger doesn't make anybody any happier. I think that's intuitively clear in the case of houses. If all the mansions were 20,000 square feet, what would happen if somebody waved a magic wand and they all had 30,000 square feet, 50% bigger? Would people be happier? We can state almost with certainty from the literature that we have on the effect of house size when it increases in tandem, that no, people would not be happier. The increase in house size would just raise the bar that defines what people feel they need. You have to entertain in a style that matches that of your peers, and so if they have bigger, you need bigger. I think the overwhelmingly likely outcome would be that if the mansions grew by that amount, the rich would all be less happy because managing the bigger properties is more hassle. So what that means is that we're wasting essentially trillions of dollars a year. I put in the book a back of the envelope estimate of at least $2 trillion a year wasted on mine is bigger, bar raising expenditures of that sort. People are going to destination weddings. That's expensive. Why do we do it? Because other people are doing it. Are people happier because they're doing it? Not really. People are spending $36,000 on their weddings on average now. They used to spend $10,000 inflation adjusted dollars in 1980. Nobody's any happier because they're spending more. It's just you have to spend more now to meet the standard. So we could get those dollars back and reallocate them to things that would actually make a difference. If you could get to work on a light rail system in 15 minutes rather than fight heavy traffic for an hour and 15 minutes, you would be healthier and happier. It would take tax revenue to build a light rail system, but if we built smaller houses, we would free up the revenue to do that. We don't do that. If everybody bought smaller and cheaper cars, we could free up some revenue to build other things that would actually make a difference in our lives. We could pave the roads better and have better roads to drive the cars on. The net experience would be a move in the positive direction on balance. So the question then is, if this conclusion is so solid in the research that documents it, and if we could actually improve our happiness, our well-being, our longevity, and other dimensions that we care about in life by allowing ourselves to be taxed more heavily and spending differently on these things that matter, increasing our expenditures on those things, why don't we elect people who would do that? That's a great question. That's, for me, kind of the, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich question. If I'm claiming that we'd be better off if we did this, why aren't we doing it? And so I try to answer that question. I wish I had tackled this question much earlier in my career. I didn't have the wit to, but I see it now as a question that needs to be addressed. And I have what strikes me as a plausible answer to it, and that's what I call the mother of all cognitive illusions. And it's shorthand for the belief held by prosperous voters, they're the ones who would be taxed to pay for the things that would matter, The Green New Deal isn't going to happen unless those voters can be taxed to pay for the green infrastructure that we need and to create the jobs that will sustain the low-income people that will have a hard time paying the carbon taxes otherwise. So we need to tax those people. They think that paying higher taxes will be harmful to them. They think it will make it harder for them to buy what they want. None of them would claim, mind you, that higher taxes would make it hard for them to buy what a person might reasonably be said to need. There's no proposal on the table that would begin to threaten that outcome. If they're worried, it's that they're worried because they won't be able to buy what they want. What do they want? They want those things that are in short supply. Everybody wants those things. There are only so many to go around. And so if they have less money, they're worried they won't be able to get them. Well, how would you think about whether that's a thing worth worrying about? The natural cognitive strategy to think about how any event will affect you is to think back to the last time you experienced that event. How did I feel then? So the last time my taxes went up significantly, how did I feel? The problem with that as a heuristic, as a rule of thumb for estimating how you'd feel, is that if you're alive today, you simply haven't experienced the fact of your taxes having gone up significantly. In World War II, the top rate was 92%. I graduated from Georgia Tech in 1966. The rate was 70% then at the top. By the time Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, it was 80%. Then it fell to 37% in the most recent round. There have been a couple of minuscule increases, too small to notice or remember. So when you try to think about how higher taxes would affect you, you can't think back to the last time that happened because it hasn't happened in your lifetime. So you need a plan B, a cognitive strategy B. And the natural one is to reckon that since higher taxes would mean you'd have less income, that's true. Nobody would deny that. You think back to the times when you had less income. How did I feel then? No matter how charmed a life you've led, there will inevitably be episodes during your life when you look back that yes, on this occasion or that occasion, I did have less income. So maybe you had a business reverse or a home fire or a health crisis. A divorce could do that. Maybe your kid got arrested. You had to hire an expensive lawyer to bail him out. You had times when your income went down, and those times, you remember them vividly, each and every one. They were horrible times. And so if that's what you imagine the effect of higher taxes would be, you're against it. But what's different about those kinds of events, each and every one of the ones I mentioned specifically, was that in those cases, your income goes down, but the incomes of other people like you stay the same as before. You have a bad business year. Your rivals don't have a bad business year. You have a home fire, nobody else does. So your relative income goes down, and when it comes to getting the scarce extras you want, how do you get those? You have to outbid other people like you who also want them. And when all of you have less money to bid, the same penthouse apartments with 360-degree views of the city end up in exactly the same hands as before. You don't give anything up. So the mother of all cognitive illusions is the fact that people don't realize that. It's not because they're stupid. I think it's quite natural to estimate the effect of higher taxes the way people do, but it's a fallacy. And I think Tom Steyer or Michael Bloomberg or any other wealthy person who wanted to could educate the public not to believe that with a 10-day advertising campaign. It would be very simple to eradicate that belief. And if people understood that they could pay substantially higher taxes and that would pay for the greening of the economy, for the paving of the roads, for the repairing of the bridges, all those things that we've been putting off doing that we know we need to do, if they realized they could do those things without having to give up anything they care about, why would they oppose that? That's the hopeful message of the book. We can do the things that seem so daunting if you don't understand the mother of all cognitive illusions without having to give up anything important at all.
That does sound hopeful. And actually, that was one of my questions in the future is this a hopeful message?
It sounds like snake oil. I'd be the first to admit. It's fiscal magic. It's creating money out of thin air, in a manner of speaking. And so people would be wise to be skeptical about whether the claim is valid, but I can tell you that I have put this claim to many critical-minded people of high intellectual capacity who would have been happy to debunk it if they could figure out a clear way to do so, and nobody has given me a cogent response to the question, why isn't it right? Why isn't this claim right?
Speaking of thin air, you used the acid rain remediation in the 90s as an example of how something went well for instituting tax policy to clean something up, and use that as an analogy for what we could potentially do towards greening the economy, like you were talking about, making things better as far as climate change, the issues that we're dealing with related to climate change. And so there's that positive story on one side, which I'd like you to talk about just briefly, but then there's also the idea of a carbon tax, which sounds negative. And how do we spin that in a way that companies can get behind that?
So let's take the first part of your question, which had to do with acid rain. When I moved to start teaching at Cornell in 1972, we saw articles about acid rain virtually every day in the local paper and in the New York Times. It was a huge problem in the Northeast. The source of the problem was that utilities in the Midwest would burn high sulfur coal that would emit hydrogen sulfide gas out of their smokestacks. It would blow eastward with the prevailing winds and then precipitate out over the Northeast as acid rain, H2SO4, sulfuric acid rain. And it was killing forests, it was killing fisheries, it was causing enormous damage. We were trying to solve that problem through very complex prescriptive regulation. The utilities had to install this or that kind of equipment. They had to buy their coal from these sources and so on. It was proceeding very slowly and it was very, very costly. For years, economists had argued that that was the wrong approach to solving a problem like that when you have pollution, the reason you have it is that it's cheaper to discharge the smoke than to filter it out. And if you want to discourage people from discharging smoke into the atmosphere, charge them for doing it. And so finally in 1990, the Congress adopted the amendments to the Clean Air Act, and they implemented a market for tradable permits to emit H2S, hydrogen sulfide. And the Sierra Club, the other environmental groups were very angry about this. They thought, that's just giving rich firms a license to pollute to their heart's content. They'll buy permits and spew smoke into the air. What a strange misconception of the reason that firms pollute. They don't pollute because they like to pollute. They aren't going to spend good money to buy permits to pollute more. And in fact, there was a cap on the amount of permits available, so they couldn't do that even if they wanted to. But because they either had to buy a permit to pollute or could sell one if they could figure out a way of filtering the pollution out that would be less costly than what they could get for selling their permit, there was an overnight shift in the amount of pollution we saw. And the studies that have been done of that program in the wake of its implementation rate it an unqualified success. Just as economists had predicted, charging for pollution was the remedy of choice in that instance. It was more effective, it was cheaper, it was quicker. The carbon emissions problem is exactly the same problem. We emit carbon because we can do it without penalty, and it costs money to filter it out or to produce goods in ways that don't emit as much of it. If we had a stiff tax on carbon, we would see the same response we saw to the tax or the requirement that you have a tradable permit for emitting H2S into the air. A tradable permit and a tax, those are just two equivalent ways of implementing what's essentially the same policy. So if we did that, and it has been tried in several jurisdictions, one of the first things that happens is people start complaining that it imposes too big a burden on the poor. The fact that we would implement a carbon tax without arranging to rebate the revenue from it in advance is what I would call political malpractice of the highest order. Of course, a tax would be hard on the poor if they have to pay it. They're already struggling to make ends meet. If we put another tax on things they buy that have carbon in them, then we're going to make life even tougher for them, and that's a perfectly valid objection. But the simplest step on earth would be to adopt a carbon tax and make it revenue neutral. That is to say, you take the revenue in from the carbon tax, and each month people get a rebate check. You take the revenue and you give it back to the people who paid the tax. ideally, you would give it back in a progressive way. Maybe rich people wouldn't get a rebate, middle income and poor people would get a rebate. And since the rich people at the top of the income ladder use way more energy per capita than others, they would be contributing most of the revenue from the carbon tax. Most of the rebates would go to people who weren't paying very much carbon tax and who didn't have much income to begin with. So you could have a rebate scheme that 80 or 90% of the population would end up getting a bigger rebate check than they'd paid in carbon taxes. What's not to like about that? The rich would be paying more on net, that's true, but they're the ones who reap most of the benefit when we invest in cleaning up the environment. So they're coming out whole too. I can't think of any excuse why politicians haven't had the wit to propose a revenue neutral carbon tax instead of letting their proposals get shot down by people who say they'll impose unacceptable hardships on the poor.
The situation you're describing reminds me of something that's going on here in Portland as of January 1st, I think it was. They instituted a bag fee at the grocery store. So I think it's maybe for both paper and plastic, but regardless, you have to pay 5 cents if you want to purchase a bag, if you didn't bring your own, at the grocery store. And people are all freaking out about it. And I'm looking at it saying, okay, well, they were giving a 5 cent reduction, a discount of 5 cents if you brought your own bag in the past. And that doesn't really make that much of a difference to anybody, whether you brought your bag or not. But if you impose a fee, even though it's still 5 cents, if you impose a fee, then that gets people to think about it. And if the goal is not necessarily to raise money, the goal is to get people to use fewer bags.
Right.
And so if you impose a fee on them for that, then it gives more incentive for people to actually behave in the way that we want them to behave.
Yeah, and it's a small fee, number one, and there's a very easy workaround. You can buy cheap cloth bags that will last for a long time. You can use those and avoid paying any fee at all. And this has been tried in many, many jurisdictions by now. It almost always succeeds without complaint after the initial rumbles about it. So really, that's a policy that we ought to see way more widespread. We know policies like that work from our experience with bottle deposits. I don't know if Oregon has one.
We do, yeah.
But many states still do not have one. And in those states, you still see what we used to see in New York and don't see and haven't seen since we've had a bottle deposit law. You don't see bottles strewn all over the landscape. If people don't return their own bottles, they say that's too much trouble. Then they put them out on the curb for recycling, and the scavengers come around and pick them and turn them in for supplemental income for themselves. So it's a solution to a problem that doesn't really harm anyone. And it's a mystery to me why we haven't seen it more widely adopted. It's just a missed opportunity.
Related to that, as we were just talking about this, your book conveys a hopeful message for here's some ways that we as a society can help fight climate change and make society better for everyone. What can individuals do? How do we spread the word?
I have a section in the book where I talk about what's called conscious consumption. This is taking individual steps to help preserve the environment, maybe buying a hybrid car or not using plastic bottles. The serious climate advocates have been scornful of conscious consumption as a solution to the climate crisis because they point out, and I think correctly they point this out, those measures by themselves, there's not enough leverage there to make a big enough dent in the problem to offer any hope of a solution. And as an economist, I used to share their skepticism about individual solutions like that. But since I've been studying behavioral contagion, I've begun to change my point of view about that. There are a couple of effects that I think we see with conscious consumption. So if you start using a permanent water bottle instead of buying plastic, if you change your diet in small ways, other people we know are going to be influenced by the fact that you've done that. And so it's not just the effect on your own behavior that changes, not just your own impact on the environment. It's how what you do affects the people who are around you. to behave. They change their behavior, and it radiates outward from them to affect still others. So the things we might do individually are not confined just to what we specifically do directly by ourselves. It's a first step in a radiant process. But maybe even more important than that is that when you take those steps, when you modify your diet in some way, when you install solar panels or buy a share of a solar farm, you help create an identity for yourself as somebody who cares about the environment. You think of yourself as a climate activist. And when that happens, then you become essentially a different person. As Aristotle taught, we are what we repeatedly do. We're creatures of habit. That's, we become who we are. We don't get born into the world being who we are. We sort of, through our behavior, become who we are. And as a climate advocate, if you develop that identity, then suddenly you are much more likely to vote for candidates for office who will implement the robust policies that we really do need to adopt in order to address this climate crisis. You're much more likely to knock on doors to help get them elected. And that's where we see real change. So I'm gone soft on the question of conscious consumption. I think you ought to investigate those possibilities and experiment with them.
I think that's a great idea. Every little bit helps. And there's the multiplier effect of if I do the thing and I influence 2 people and then they influence 4 people and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it slightly differently. I would say every little bit helps way more than you think.
Yeah, I like that. So I have 2 more questions, and I'm going to take a cue from the final chapter in the book. What is your passion?
As I recount in the book, nobody had ever asked me that, and as an economist, we don't think of ourselves as passion-ridden creatures. Really, we're bean counters, But truth to tell, I would say I have a passion for efficiency. Many economists share that, but I think I feel that passion more keenly than even most of my colleagues. I think about waste in every environment I find myself in, and the way we spend our money now, the way we use our energy now is wasteful to a degree that if somebody ever caused that much waste on purpose, it would be a moral violation of unimaginably serious extent. It's not deliberate, so we can't get angry at them for it. But if you think about the economists' urge to make the pie bigger, why do economists care about that? It just means to make it more efficient. The pie represents the value of all the things we have to distribute among ourselves. If we make the pie bigger, what's true is that it's always possible to distribute the pie in a way that everybody gets a bigger slice than before. You can draw the pie and have the angles of the slices stay the same, let the diameter of the pie get bigger. Every slice is then bigger than before. Why wouldn't you want to do that? And so for me, I would say, with some embarrassment, because many people wouldn't understand why I say it, that my calling, my passion is to make the pie bigger, because that will enable people to achieve more of what they want to achieve in life. And that's a good thing.
So my final question of the interview is, are there any points from the book that I didn't ask you about that you would like to tell our audience?
The last chapter in the book does take up the question of how you might try to engage with somebody who doesn't agree with you. I mean, I think that there's been a lot written about the polarized environment. What's really true is that it's very difficult to make any headway in a conversation with somebody who's not in your tribe. And I thought, since I'm so eager to make headway in conversations like that, I wanted to learn more about what researchers have discovered about how you might be able to make headway in difficult conversations. And there's a quite striking finding in that literature, which is that if you try to explain something to somebody on the other side, they immediately sense that you're trying to attack them in some way. They get defensive, they get angry, they dig in, they cling ever more tenaciously to whatever view they were holding to begin with. That's counterproductive. It's better not to have a conversation at all than to have one like that. But what researchers have discovered is that if you can somehow come up with the right question to ask somebody on the other side, then that has a completely different effect on where the conversation goes. And I'll just give you one example, which is that in my own conversations with people who were opposed to the Affordable Care Act, and there were tens of millions of them. I didn't speak with that many people, obviously, but I spoke with many of them. And the feature of the Obamacare Act that they didn't like, the one they hated, really, was the mandate. It was absolutely an overreach by government to make you buy insurance. What if I don't want to buy insurance? They thought that was just an indefensible feature of the act. You could try to explain to them that if you didn't have a mandate, the insurance pool wouldn't be stable, it would unravel, you'd have adverse selection. There are all sorts of sophisticated reasons why the mandate was necessary, but those conversations went nowhere. Almost never would you make progress with that approach. But I just stumbled onto a question that seemed to unlock the logjam. And the question was this: what do you think would happen if the government required a home insurance company to sell fire insurance at affordable rates to people whose homes had already burned down? You don't really need to think about that question very long before it's obvious to you. First of all, it's not a threatening question. You're not angry or defensive when you consider it. It's kind of interesting. Well, what would happen? People quickly volunteer that if the government required insurers to sell affordable fire insurance to people after their houses had already burned down, then nobody would buy fire insurance until his house burned down. And the fire insurance companies would go bankrupt in short order. They'd have to replace houses costing $500,000 on the strength of premiums of a couple $100 a year. There's no way they could stay in business. At that point, you may be able to offer something about healthcare into the conversation, but often, if you've been talking about healthcare to begin with, people will see all by themselves that the patient with a pre-existing condition is exactly the guy whose house is already burned down. If you want to require insurance companies to sell health insurance at affordable rates to that person, the companies are going to go bankrupt unless you have some mechanism to keep everybody else in the pool. And that's what the mandate is designed to do. If you don't buy insurance and you're healthy, you're preventing people who really need insurance, people with pre-existing conditions, from getting the coverage that they desperately need. You're causing harm to them. Every other country has universal coverage. We don't have that. So ask questions. Go forth. Have conversations. Ask people the most interesting questions you can and see if you can make some progress. If we don't make progress, we're cooked.
So with that, we will say thank you to Robert Frank.
Thank you, Amanda. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Go buy his book. It's called Under the Influence: Putting Peer Pressure to Work. Thanks for listening. We're definitely going to keep recording our live events and turning them into podcast episodes. However, we're hoping that this interview format could work with other scientists and authors who don't live near Portland. Let us know what you think. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at SciBar Podcast. Thanks to the folks at Princeton University Press who helped set this up. Also, thank you to my friends who helped me figure out how to record a remote conversation, and to Graham Tully for making us all sound good. As always, thanks to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set.
And you're just in time to save the